line for your questions answered. Well, so many questions sent in by you about the ceasefire deal and what will happen next. So joining me to answer those questions from Jerusalem, we have our correspondent Jonah Fisher. He's going to be with us in just a moment. The BBC Monitoring's Hesham Shawish, who's in London, and as well our diplomatic correspondent James Landale here in the studio with me. We have a lot of questions to put to the three of you. So I'm going to ask you to give us full answers, of course, but to get through as many of those questions as possible. Hesham, I'm going to go to you first. We've had a number of questions that have been asked by a huge number of people, so I'm not going to mention any specific names on these, but Hesham, questions: how many people have been killed in this war and how many Israeli soldiers have been killed?
Okay.
The Gaza-based Ministry of Health, the total number of confirmed dead has now reached around 47,000, and that's alongside 111,000 wounded. But many have said that the real figure is much higher. A recent study in the Lancet Medical Journal said that that was a major underestimate, and that figure also includes around 18,000 children, 200 journalists, and over 1,000 health workers, according to Doctors Without Borders. Of course, we have to also take into account the conflicts between Hezbollah and Israel, because that was linked closely to the Gaza conflict. So in Lebanon, the death toll was around 3,700. That's both combatants and civilians, and there were more than 15,000 wounded there. In terms of Israeli fatalities, the Israeli army has said that 840 Israeli soldiers have been killed, both in Gaza and on the northern front, following the conflicts with Hezbollah, and around 815 civilians have also been killed in Israel.
Thank you for going through those details. Let's cross over to Jonah in Jerusalem now, Jonah Fisher. And again, one of the questions that we have been asked over and over again, Jonah, is just to explain the key terms of the deal that's in place.
Sorry, can you just repeat your question?
Yes, Jonah, I hope you can hear me. One question we've had multiple people asking about is to explain what the key terms of the deal are.
Right, so it's a three-phase deal. The first phase is really the only part that has been agreed on, and today there is indeed a bit of uncertainty as to whether exactly all the deals have been agreed on, but working on the basis that it's the draft deal which everyone has seen prior to it being confirmed last night. It's a 42-day ceasefire, and during that period of 42 days, there will be 33 Israeli hostages released in a phased release. We don't know for sure that all those 33 are still alive. The first 3 women will be released on the first day of the deal. We believe that's going to be on Sunday, and then throughout the 42 days there will be Israeli hostages released, or their remains will be handed over, and in return dozens of Palestinian prisoners will be released from Israeli jails. Israeli troops will move back from the more densely populated parts of the Gaza Strip, mostly towards the eastern edge, which borders Israel, and there will be more allowed in, more fuel trucks will be allowed in as well. What the is being discussed, and looks like it's been agreed now, does discussions about another group of hostages, men of military age, who are still going to remain in Gaza pending further discussions, and also the bigger questions really about what Gaza will look like in the future, who might govern it, and is this really the end of the war? Is this a permanent ceasefire? That has all been kicked down the road, if you like, during the first phase. Those discussions are supposed to start again as to try and resolve those fundamental questions for Gaza's longer-term future.
Thank you, Jonah. We had a few technical glitches during that answer, but hopefully the line will come good. I'll bring in James Landale now. And James, this question is from Ruth in Oxford, who asks, if and when the ceasefire deal really happens and takes hold, are there any indications about who will organise and pay for the much-needed and hugely expensive physical reconstruction of Gaza?
Well, this is all something that would happen during the third phase. We heard Jonah talking about the phase 1 and 2 there. During the third phase of this deal, namely when there is a permanent ceasefire and people start thinking about who's going to govern Gaza, who's going to keep Gaza secure, who's going to help with the reconstruction. And that means we're a long way off that process. The second point to make is that whatever happens, it's going to be hugely expensive. There have been a variety of different assessments, anything up to $80 billion. That was the most recent assessment by the RAND organization, a sort of big think tank in the United States, last autumn. And it's a huge operation. It's going to take many, many years, if not decades. And what everybody points out is that it's not just a question of reconstruction. First of all, it is about removing the rubble before you get to a position where you can actually start rebuilding. And so that, in other words, it's a two-stage process and it's hugely complicated. Who's going to pay for that? The international community. But remember this, I've been to conferences where they've discussed the rebuilding of Syria. That hasn't happened yet. I've been to conferences where they've discussed the rebuilding of Ukraine. That hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of money the international community is spending elsewhere, and a lot of it is going to have to go to Gaza.
And a bit of overlap, James, in this question from Dr. Stefan Lapworth, who asks, will other countries be allowed into Gaza to help with rebuilding in the areas Israel have destroyed, he asks?
I mean, look, as and when there is a permanent, if there is a permanent ceasefire, yes, the international community will be allowed in, simply because, they are the ones who will be required to bring in, the kit, the equipment, the machinery. It's going to have to be an absolutely massive operation, and it would last many, many years.
OK, the next question is anonymous. It's for all three of you, though. And the question is, who is going to govern Gaza in the future? So we'll get the international view, the view from Israel, and the Arab and Palestinian view. Let's begin with that, Hesham.
Yeah, so that's a real sticking point underlying everything that hasn't been resolved yet. It's a really important question. The Palestinians have been adamant that control of the enclave should be in their hands. We saw reports last month of this reconciliation deal between Hamas and Fatah. They're the two main rival Palestinian factions. But these statements of unity are always, or have been in the past, been very, very short-lived. At the time of that reconciliation deal, Hamas prominently reported on the deal, whereas we didn't see any reporting of the agreement in Fatah-affiliated media sources. So that's very, very telling. And also previous reconciliation efforts between the two groups have not been realized as well. What we've also seen this week in Israeli media reports is that the Palestinian Authority, that's a Fatah-controlled governing body which runs parts of the West Bank. Apparently, they've been having talks with President-elect Trump on running Gaza alone without Hamas. But that idea hasn't in the past been rejected by the Netanyahu government. They want complete control of the security situation in the enclave, and they will not allow Hamas to gain the upper hand in the Strip once again.
And Jonah, talk to us in a little bit more detail then about Israel's view on that question of who is going to govern Gaza in the future.
Israel doesn't want Hamas to be involved in government. It also doesn't want the Palestinian Authority involved, because it views that as a step towards a two-state solution. And I think it's worth making the point that we've had 15 months of war, and if this ceasefire deal goes ahead as planned on Sunday, there is no real plan in place. Israel has not prepared any plan as to what will happen, who will be in charge during that immediate period. So it is very possible that we will see the previous government, which is effectively Hamas, coming out of the woodwork and again trying to exert influence and positions of power. So I think the clearest thing we can say is there is no plan at the moment. It has been mentioned that there might be some sort of technocratic committee put in place of non-politically connected Palestinians, perhaps under some kind of international authority. But that hasn't been finalised as yet either. There simply hasn't been a lot of thought put into what will come next in the first days of peace.
And James, then, the international view on governance?
Look, the international community says in theory that it would like to take part, but whenever you prod foreign ministers and say, well, what would your country be prepared to contribute, they go a little bit quiet because everybody is very cautious about getting caught up in something that they can't control, particularly if it is the offer of armed forces to organize, to be playing some kind of role, establishing security in some kind of temporary interim administration. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and in some respects, one of the reasons why that has been left silent as part of this deal is because there is no agreement at the moment. But what's really interesting is the one point the Americans have been making in recent days, both the President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, they've all been saying, look, if you are going to get to that third stage, to get that, unlock all that international support, you have to have a political horizon. In other words, you've got to have a Palestinian state there as a goal, as an aim. And until you have that, you're not going to get the support, financial or otherwise, from countries in the Gulf and elsewhere that you will need to go through this whole process of governing and reconstituting Gaza after the fighting stops.
So more questions than answers on that particular question at the moment. Jonah, back to you for this next question from JW, who asks, what happened to all the Hamas terror tunnels? Have they all been destroyed?
Well, we've had regular updates from the IDF, the Israeli Armed Forces, claiming responsibility for destroying various parts of this tunnel network under Gaza, where we believe hostages, ammunition, all sorts of things, including Hamas fighters, have been hid during the course of this war. Obviously, we are not there. We can't see with our own eyes. I think it is worth pointing out that despite 15 months of hugely destructive war in Gaza, in which the Israeli Defense Forces have gone, pretty thoroughly through, particularly northern Gaza, Hamas is still there, and they have been popping up and killing IDF soldiers. There are 15 in the last 10 days or so. Proof perhaps that some of those networks, some of those tunnels perhaps are still operable, that there are still ways that Hamas has been able to operate despite the overwhelming Israeli military presence.
Jonah, thank you. Hesham, this one is for you. It's from Mike in Brighton, who asks, as part of the ceasefire deal, the UN's Palestinian Refugee Agency says hundreds of trucks of supplies will be allowed by Israel to enter Gaza daily. How do we know that Israel will honour this commitment, he asks?
Yeah, it's really a wait and see situation. On the previous agreements, previous promises for unfettered entry of humanitarian aid into the enclave, they weren't met, and there were chronic shortages of food, fuel, essential medical supplies. We constantly saw these reports of restrictions being placed on convoys and trucks having to wait for weeks outside at the crossing point. So it will really be a wait and see situation. And then we also saw contradictory statements, Israel putting out statements saying that they denied placing restrictions on trucks going in, and then the UN and aid agencies coming out with statements nearly every day saying that there were obstacles being placed on aid trucks, and that Palestinians were facing famine, and that newborns were dying of hypothermia. So lots of statements like this. So it will really be a wait and see situation after the ceasefire comes into effect on Sunday.
OK, Hesham, thanks for that answer. Back to you, Jonah, for this next question. Anonymous, how will the ceasefire deal impact Benjamin Netanyahu's grip on power, or will it have any effect on Israel's internal power balance? Good question.
That is a good question. It is, and it's playing out right now here in Israel. We are expecting a cabinet meeting to take place some point today to discuss this ceasefire agreement, and already we know that there are members of that cabinet, far-right ultra-nationalist members, people who, for example, would like to continue with the war in Gaza and have a total victory, and even annex parts, more settled parts of the West Bank. So there are some very strong voices in the cabinet who are against this deal. I think generally the view is that in terms of simply getting it through cabinet, getting it through government, that they do have the numbers. What's unknown at this point is whether these far-right politicians are so upset that they are willing to quit government and try and take Mr. Netanyahu's administration down. That could potentially derail things a little bit further down the line. I think the view is that it would still take several months before there was a fresh election here. But certainly there is the potential, if these far-right politicians want to take it that far, that it could destabilise the government. Another consideration, though, is that these far-right, the security minister, the finance minister, may want to stay in with an incoming administration in the United States led by President Trump. They may have their eyes on other goals. For example, American approval for the annexation of more territory in the West Bank. So it may be that they are kicking up a fuss now, making a big deal about it publicly, but they may decide that it's in their longer term interest to hold their noses while this deal goes through and hope to gain something at a later stage.
OK, Jonah, thank you for that. Another anonymous question. This one's for you, Hesham. The sender of this question says, I have a question about the Gaza ceasefire. The Houthis said that their attacks on the Red Sea and on Israel were in solidarity with the Palestinians and that their attacks would only end when Israel's attacks ended. So would a ceasefire stop these attacks, is the question.
That's a very important question. We're watching closely for reaction from Iran-backed groups in the region, like the Houthis and also Hezbollah in Iran, in Lebanon. They have both directly linked their attacks against Israel to the situation in Gaza. It's really hoped that the ceasefire will be adhered to and that the situation in the region will cool down. The Houthi leader, Abdel Malik al-Houthi, is due to give a speech in the next few hours, and he'll outline his reaction to the announcement of the ceasefire. This morning, the group released a general statement saying that they praised the what they called the steadfastness of the Palestinians and that they were satisfied with their support front for Hamas since October 2023. But in terms of future policy, we'll wait for that speech by the Houthi leader in the next few hours.
OK. Back to you now, James. And this is from Paul in Edinburgh, who asks, is there anything the panel can say for certain about what the peace deal will mean for Israel and Palestinians and the wider Middle East? Or at this stage, are you only able to speculate? Now, certainty is a pretty rare quality in politics sometimes, isn't it?
It's pretty rare quality in the Middle East. Look, I think we can be fairly sure that the first phase of this deal, if it comes to force on Sunday, if the fighting stops, that means the fighting stops. That means people in Gaza from day one can live a different life. They will get access to humanitarian aid. Some hostages may be released. Some Palestinian prisoners may be released too. If that happens from day one on Sunday, as has been agreed, well, that is a substantial change that we hadn't seen before. Anything beyond that, I think, is much, much harder to say there's going to be any kind of certainty about. Because we simply don't know. The second phase, this idea that the final hostages released, more Palestinian prisoners released, and a permanent ceasefire agreed to, is still to be negotiated. It's not definitive. And so before you get to any of the other stuff, such as discussions about potential normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, maybe some kind of diminution of the Houthi attacks that we were just talking, a bit more stability in Lebanon, maybe some kind of stability in Syria as it tries to reconstitute itself after the fall of Assad. All of these uncertainties, if the conflict in Gaza ceases, then that potentially could ease the pressure on a lot of these issues. But none of that is guaranteed.
And as Jonah was alluding to, if all of this ends up with Benjamin Netanyahu's government collapsing, then another phase of uncertainty.
Correct.
Yeah. Back to you, Jonah. This is from Anna. A very pertinent question for you. Will journalists be allowed into Gaza when the ceasefire gets underway?
Yeah, a good question, and a point really that's worth making from the very start is that there are very brave Palestinian journalists who've been reporting and indeed dying in Gaza throughout this conflict to get the story out. We ourselves at the BBC have a network of freelancers who we talk to on a daily basis and who very bravely go out and film material for us from Gaza. But yeah, it's true that throughout this conflict, Israel has not allowed foreigners to go into Gaza to report on this. They say that is due to security reasons. We, of course, would disagree. The BBC, of course, reports from many dangerous places around the world. And at the same time as foreign journalists are being kept out, hundreds of international aid workers are being allowed in and out of Gaza all the time to do their work. So yes, I would much rather be reporting, be talking to you now from Khan Yunis rather than standing here on the bureau balcony here in Jerusalem. But throughout this conflict, Israel has not made it possible for foreign journalists to go in. And look, we just don't know whether that will change or how rapidly that might change when the ceasefire comes in.
OK, James, for you, from Adrian in Leighton Buzzard, who asks, will the ceasefire deal bring long-term peace?
I wish I could say yes, but I just genuinely do not know.
It's one of those uncertain things.
It is uncertain, and to claim knowledge of that, no one can claim that knowledge.
What can we say then about what politicians have been speculating about in the last few days, or talking about? President Biden, for example, in his address yesterday was talking about a path towards a two-state solution. Others would take a look at this deal and say that seems quite an uncertain prospect, based on the terms of this deal anyway. What are your thoughts on that, and what might President Trump want to bring to the table on this?
Well, the Trump agenda is an interesting one because we don't know it entirely. We know that he has put huge pressure on the Israelis to come to the table to agree this particular stage of the deal. But once his inauguration happens next week, then that particular bit of leverage disappears. And we don't know what else he said to Benjamin Netanyahu about what should or should not happen in the phase 2 period of this agreement that's about to be agreed. So there's a degree of uncertainty with that. Look, certainly the outgoing Biden administration have all been saying, look, you know, the elements have been put in place for this deal to become something greater than it is. But at the moment, there is still a huge amount of uncertainty, disagreement over precisely where the politics should go on this. But look, the international community is all saying, look, you've got to use this moment now to get to that point where you can have a conversation. Because so take, for example, I mentioned a moment ago this idea of Israel and Saudi Arabia normalizing their relations. Now, that is something that the Biden administration have sought. It is something that President Biden wants. In his statement yesterday, he mentioned this. He really, really wants this. He sees this as unfinished business because of other deals he brokered during his first term, the so-called Abraham Accords, where Israel did deals and normalization deals with other Arab countries. But the point is this, the world has changed. Those previous deals were all done on the basis that lip service was paid to what was called the Palestinian issue. That's different now. The Saudis will not agree to a deal unless there is a two-state solution on the table. And we know that many Israelis do not want that, and we know many Americans don't want it either.
Jonah, I just want to go back to you finally. We had a few technical glitches earlier, and you were mentioning some of the hostages, but there have been a lot of questions specifically asking how many hostages are still in Gaza and who are they? So if you could recap that for us as well, please, Jonah.
Sure. So there were about 250 hostages taken on the October the 7th, 2023 attacks. Some of them were released in an early release in November of that year. Some of them have died. A few of them were rescued. There are reckoned to be about 94 who are left unaccounted for. 33 names have been put forward to be part of this first phase, and those are basically women, children, the elderly, the injured and the sick. It's not clear how many of those 33 are still alive or not. That leaves about 60. Those are men of military age who are not part of the first phase, would be part of the second phase of negotiations. And once again, we don't know how many of those 60 or so are still alive. That the broad estimate that is cast around for the big total of 94 is probably about half of those hostages